Tonight, we read from the oldest record of rulership ever discovered. Not interpreted, not summarized, not filtered through centuries of religious editing. The actual words, carved into clay over 4,000 years ago, listing kings who ruled for lengths of time that should be impossible. 241,000 years of reign before the flood came and changed everything. What if these numbers are not mythology? What if they are memory? Let your breath slow. Let the noise of the modern world fall away, and listen to what the Sumerians were desperately trying to tell us. The clay tablet sits behind glass in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. It is called the Weld-Blundell Prism, catalog number WB444. It is one of the most important historical documents ever unearthed. 4 sides of baked clay covered in neat cuneiform script, listing every king who ruled Mesopotamia from the beginning of kingship itself. The beginning. Not the beginning of Sumerian civilization, the beginning of kingship on earth. The tablet states this explicitly. It opens with a phrase that scholars have translated again and again, each time arriving at the same unsettling words. When kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not when humans invented government. Not when tribes chose leaders. When kingship descended from heaven, as if rulership itself was a technology, a system, a gift brought from somewhere else, installed in humanity's first city, Eridu, the oldest city on earth according to Sumerian tradition. Located in what is now southern Iraq, its ruins still visible, its foundations dating back to approximately 5400 BCE by conventional archaeology. But the King List suggests it is far older. The list suggests Eridu was already ancient when the first human civilizations supposedly began. And it was here, in Eridu, that the first king took his throne. His name was Alulim, and he ruled for 28,800 years. Let that number settle into your mind. 28,800 years. A single reign lasting longer than all of recorded human history combined. Longer than the span from the last ice age to today. One king, one throne, one impossibly long rule. Modern scholars dismiss this as mythology, as exaggeration, as the primitive tendency to inflate the achievements of ancestors. They assume the Sumerians were using symbolic numbers, representing something other than literal years. But here is what those scholars rarely mention. The numbers are not random. They are not poetic approximations. They are precise mathematical calculations, all divisible by a single unit that the Sumerians considered sacred, the sar, 3,600. Every reign length in the Antediluvian section of the King List is perfectly divisible by this number. Every single one. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. That is exactly 8 sar. His successor, Alalgar, ruled in the same city for 36,000 years. Exactly 10 sar. The pattern continues through all 8 kings who ruled before the flood. Not approximately divisible, exactly divisible. As if the Sumerians were using a counting system based on this specific unit. as if they were measuring something real. What if the SAR represents something we have forgotten? What if these rain lengths are not mythology, but measurement in a system we no longer understand? The Weld-Blundell Prism was discovered in 1922 by the expedition of Herbert Weld and is one of 17 known copies of the Sumerian King List. These copies were found at different sites across Mesopotamia, created at different times over a span of centuries, yet they all preserve the same essential information, the same kings, the same cities, the same impossible numbers. The history of these discoveries is itself remarkable. The first fragments of the King List came to light in the late 19th century as European archaeologists began systematic excavation of Mesopotamian sites. Initial finds were puzzling. Tablets with lists of names and numbers, clearly important but difficult to interpret without complete examples. The breakthrough came with the discovery of more complete versions. The Weld-Blundell Prism, found at Larsa in what is now southern Iraq, provided the most comprehensive text. It was a four-sided clay prism, each face covered with carefully inscribed cuneiform, designed to be rotated and read in sequence. The scribe who created this prism worked during the reign of King Sin-Magir of Isin, around 1817 BCE. He was not composing the King List from scratch. He was copying it from earlier sources, preserving a tradition that was already ancient in his time. How ancient? The King List itself provides a clue. It records dynasties from the beginning of kingship to the scribe's own era. If we accept the post-flood chronology as approximately historical, the document traces over 1,500 years of history. If we accept the Antediluvian section as well, it reaches back 241,000 years further. The Weld-Blundell Prism now resides in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, where it has been studied by scholars for a century. High-resolution photographs and detailed transliterations have made its content available worldwide. Anyone can now read what that Mesopotamian scribe carefully copied nearly 4,000 years ago. Other significant copies include the UCBC text at Berkeley, which preserves variant readings useful for understanding how the tradition was transmitted. The Kish tablet, found at that ancient city, focuses primarily on post-flood dynasties, but confirms the essential structure. The Larsa King List, the King List, and various fragments all contribute to our understanding. The process of decipherment took decades. Cuneiform script, used throughout Mesopotamia for over 3,000 years, was forgotten after the fall of the ancient civilizations that used it. Recovery began in the 19th century, with scholars painstakingly matching symbols to sounds and meanings. By the time the King List was discovered, cuneiform could be read. But reading and understanding are different things. The numbers in the Antediluvian section were so extraordinary that initial translators assumed errors. Perhaps the symbols had been misread. Perhaps the mathematical system was misunderstood. Perhaps the tablet was damaged or corrupted. Further discoveries eliminated these possibilities. Multiple independent copies showed the same numbers. The mathematical system was well understood from many other texts. The tablets were clear and intact. The numbers were what the Sumerians intended to write. Acceptance came slowly. Many scholars simply ignored the Antediluvian section, focusing on the historical dynasties that could be verified. Others treated the early kings as mythological figures, their reign lengths as symbolic rather than literal. A few took the numbers seriously and began to ask what they might mean. That debate continues today. The King List remains a contested document, its interpretation divided between those who see mythology and those who see memory. The tablets themselves take no position. They simply record what the scribes believed was true. This consistency is significant. When scribes copy documents over centuries, errors accumulate, details shift, numbers change. But the core data of the King List remained remarkably stable across all known versions. The antediluvian kings always number 8. Their reign lengths always follow the same mathematical pattern. The flood always appears as the dividing line between one age and another. Either multiple scribes across centuries all made the same precise errors, or they were preserving something they considered genuinely important, something they believed was true. The tablet does not present these kings as gods. It does not describe them with the language used for divine beings elsewhere in Sumerian literature. It treats them as rulers, as administrators, as holders of kingship. The divinity, if any, lies in the source of their authority, the heaven from which kingship descended, not in the kings themselves. This distinction matters. The Sumerians had extensive mythology about their gods. They knew how to write about divine beings. When they wrote the King List, they chose different language. They wrote it as history, as record, as chronicle. They wrote it the way we write lists of presidents or monarchs, as fact, not as fable. Before the flood, kingship existed in 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. 8 kings ruled across these cities for a combined total of 241,200 years. Let me name them, as the tablets name them, in the order of their reign. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalgar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. Enmengalana of Bad Tibira, 28,800 years. The divine Dumuzid, the shepherd of Bad Tibira, 36,000 years. Ensipad Zidana of the Rock, 28,800 years. Enmendurana of Sippar, 21,000 years. Ubaratutu of Shuruppak, 18,600 years. 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over the land. Let us examine each antediluvian king more closely, for they deserve more than simple listing. Each name carries meaning. Each reign represents a chapter in the prehistory of our species. Alulim of Eridu, the first king. His name may derive from Sumerian words meaning stag or grown from the waters. He ruled for 28,800 years, exactly 8 sar. His city, Eridu, was considered the oldest and most sacred city in Sumerian tradition. The temple of Enki stood there, god of wisdom, fresh water, and creation. What did Alulim-Du for 28,800 years. The King List does not say. It records only his name, his city, and his reign length. But consider the time span. 28,800 years is longer than all of human civilization as conventionally understood. Longer than the span from the cave paintings of Lascaux to the skyscrapers of modern cities. One king, one reign, watching over humanity as it developed from whatever we were into whatever we became. Alalgar of Eridu succeeded him. His name may mean the king who brings plenty. He ruled for 36,000 years, exactly 10 Sar. Together, these first two kings ruled Eridu for 64,800 years. Two kings, one city, longer than we can truly comprehend. Then kingship passed to Bad Tabira. This city's name means Fortress of the Metalworkers, suggesting it was an industrial center, a place of craft and manufacturing. 3 kings ruled there. Enmenluana, whose name means Lord of the Powers of Heaven and Earth, held the longest reign of any antediluvian king. 43,200 years, 12 Sar. If the numbers are literal, this single king watched over humanity for longer than any other individual before the flood. His name suggests mastery of both celestial and terrestrial realms, as if he stood at the junction between worlds. Enmengalana succeeded him, ruling for 28,800 years, the same length as the first king. His name means Lord of the Great Powers of Heaven. The word great distinguishes him from his predecessor, though the nature of his greatness is not specified. Then came the divine Dumuzid, the shepherd. His name means faithful son, and the title shepherd suggests a pastoral role, a guardian of flocks, both literal and metaphorical. He ruled for 36,000 years and would later become one of the most important deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon. The worship of Dumuzid persisted for millennia after the King List was compiled. He was associated with vegetation, with the cycle of seasons, with death and resurrection. Each year, rituals mourned his descent to the underworld and celebrated his return. His journey between realms became a template for understanding life, death, and renewal. That a king from the antediluvian age became a god of the post-flood world is significant. The dividing line between divine and royal was permeable. What were the antediluvian kings? The King List calls them kings. Later tradition worshipped at least one of them as a god. The categories we use to separate these concepts may not apply. After Bad Tabira, kingship moved to Larak. Only one king ruled there before the flood. Ense-Padzid-Ana reigned for 28,800 years. His name may mean Lord who determines the faithful life of heaven. Larak itself is less well known than the other antediluvian cities. Its ruins have not been definitively located. It exists primarily in texts, a city known only through the records that mention it. Then kingship passed to Sippar, the city of the sun god Shamash. Sippar would later become famous for its astronomical observations, its libraries, its learned priests. But in the antediluvian age, it hosted only one king. Enmendur-Ana ruled for 21,000 years. We have already discussed his significance as the seventh king, the one taken to heaven, the founder of divinatory traditions. His shorter reign, compared to some predecessors, may reflect his time away from earthly rule while receiving celestial knowledge. Finally, kingship came to Shuruppak, where it would end with the flood. Ubara Tutu ruled for 18,600 years. His name may mean friend of Tutu, with Tutu being another name for the god Marduk. He was the eighth king, the last before the waters came. His city would become famous as the home of the flood survivor. Whether Ziusudra was related to the king, perhaps a son or grandson, the texts do not clearly specify. These 8 kings span an enormous range of time, and yet share common features. Their names connect them to heavenly powers. Their reign lengths follow mathematical patterns. Their cities progress from Eridu, the oldest, to Shuruppak, where the old world ended. The pattern suggests progression, knowledge accumulating, power concentrating, something building toward a culmination that never came, interrupted by the flood that swept over the land. That phrase appears in every version of the King List. Then the flood swept over the land. It marks the boundary between one age and another, between one type of rulership and another. Before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reign lengths immediately shortened to centuries, then to decades, then to the normal human lifespan we recognize from our own history. Something changed. Something ended. The flood was not merely a natural disaster in Sumerian understanding. It was a transition between epochs, a reset of the system, a change in the fundamental nature of how the world operated. The city of Shuruppak, where the last antediluvian king ruled, is significant. In Sumerian flood mythology, Shuruppak is the home of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah. He was warned of the coming deluge by the god Enki and instructed to build a vessel to survive the waters. The King List places the last pre-flood king in this exact city, connecting the historical record to the mythological narrative. Ubara Tutu of Shuruppak, the last king before the world changed. His reign ended not with death or succession, but with catastrophe. And when the waters receded, kingship had to descend from heaven once again. After the flood, the kingship descended from heaven. The kingship was in Kish. Kish, a new city, a new beginning. But already the pattern had changed. The first king of Kish, according to the tablets, was Jushur. He ruled for 1,200 years, still impossibly long by our standards, but a fraction of the antediluvian reigns. The compression had begun. The first dynasty of Kish contained 23 kings. Let us examine their reigns, for the pattern they reveal is striking. Jushur ruled for 1,200 years. Kulassinabel ruled for 960 years. Nan-Gishlishma ruled for 670 years. The decline was not linear, but it was consistent. Each generation held power for less time than the one before. By the middle of the dynasty, reigns had shortened to centuries rather than millennia. Tizkar ruled for 306 years. Ilku ruled for 900 years. There were fluctuations, but the overall trajectory pointed downward. The final kings of the first dynasty ruled for periods we might almost call normal. Aga ruled for 625 years. These are still impossibly long by our biological understanding, but compared to the 43,000 years of Enmenluana, they represent a collapse of longevity. Something was being lost. Whatever had allowed the antediluvian kings their impossible reigns was draining away, generation by generation, dynasty by dynasty. The King List records a total of 39,144 years for the entire first dynasty of Kish. This is still enormous by modern standards, but it is less than the reign of a single antediluvian king. The compression ratio is staggering. After Kish, kingship passed to Uruk, one of the most famous cities of ancient Mesopotamia. The first dynasty of Uruk included names that would echo through subsequent mythology. Meshki-Angashur was the son of the sun god Utu. He entered the sea and disappeared. His reign was 324 years. Even the founder of this dynasty, connected to divine parentage, ruled for only a fraction of the antediluvian terms. Enmerkar, his son, built Uruk according to the King List. He ruled for 420 years. Under him, Uruk became the greatest city of its age, its walls legendary, its temples magnificent. But 420 years is barely a blink compared to 28,800. Then came Lugal-Banda, the shepherd. He ruled for 1,200 years, a temporary reversal of the declining trend. Lugal-Banda appears in Sumerian mythology as a heroic figure, the father of the greatest hero of all. Dumuzid, a different figure from the antediluvian king of the same name, ruled for 100 years. The name persisted, but the power had diminished. And then came Gilgamesh, the hero, the legend, the subject of the oldest epic poem in human history. Gilgamesh, son of Lugal-Banda, ruled Uruk for 126 years. In the epic that bears his name, he is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. He possesses superhuman strength and beauty. He builds the magnificent walls of Uruk. He seeks the secret of eternal life, but he fails. The epic records his journey to find Utanapishtim, the flood survivor who had been granted immortality. Gilgamesh learns the story of the flood. He briefly obtains the plant of rejuvenation, but a serpent steals it while he sleeps, and he returns to Uruk empty-handed, mortal, destined to die. The Epic of Gilgamesh is, among other things, a meditation on the loss of immortality. The hero is part divine, closer to the antediluvian kings than any human since. Yet even he cannot reclaim what was lost. Even he must accept the limits that the flood imposed on humanity. His reign of 126 years, recorded in the King List, places him firmly in the post-flood era of diminished lifespans. Whatever made the antediluvian kings what they were, Gilgamesh did not have it. He could seek it, dream of it, quest for it, but he could not attain it. The king list continues through dynasty after dynasty. Uruk gives way to Ur. Ur gives way to Awan. Kingship bounces from city to city, sometimes seized by conquest, sometimes passing peacefully. The reign lengths continue their decline. By the time we reach historical kings who can be verified through other records, terms have shortened to decades. Sargon of Akkad, the first great empire builder, ruled for 56 years. This is long by modern standards, but represents a complete collapse from the Antediluvian age. The transition from mythology to history in the king list is seamless. There is no break, no annotation, no indication that the scribes saw any difference between the 43,000-year reign of En-men-Luana and the 56-year reign of Sargon. Both were kings. Both held the kingship that descended from heaven. Both were entries in the same continuous record. This continuity is itself significant. The Sumerians did not separate their history into mythological and historical periods. They did not dismiss the antediluvian kings as legends while treating later rulers as real. They recorded all of it with the same care, the same precision, the same sense of importance. Either they were incapable of distinguishing fact from fiction, or they did not see any fiction to distinguish. Either they preserved careful lies alongside careful truths, or they believed it was all truth. The post-flood sections of the king list have been partially verified by other records. Archaeological evidence confirms many of the cities, dynasties, and rulers named in later sections. Where we can check the king list against independent evidence, it proves remarkably accurate. This accuracy extends to details that the scribes could not have invented, reign lengths that match other records, successions that align with independent king lists from specific cities, military campaigns that can be confirmed through other sources. If the historical sections are accurate, what does that tell us about the antediluvian sections? The scribes who carefully preserved verifiable historical data were the same scribes who carefully preserved the impossible reign lengths. They used the same methods. They applied the same standards. They saw no difference. Perhaps we should trust their consistency. Perhaps we should consider that their historical accuracy in checkable sections reflects overall reliability. Perhaps the antediluvian records are as accurate as the historical ones, which would mean that everything we think we know about human history is wrong. The post-flood kings ruled for progressively shorter periods, 1,200 years, 900 years, 600 years. The numbers declined systematically, as if something was being lost, as if each generation retained less of whatever had allowed the earlier kings their impossible longevity. By the time we reach historical kings we can verify through other records, reign lengths have shrunk to normal human spans. 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. The king list transitions seamlessly from mythology to history, from the impossible to the verifiable, without any indication that the scribes saw a difference. To them, it was all history. Alulim ruling for 28,000 years and Sargon ruling for 56 years were both entries in the same continuous record. Both were kings. Both held the kingship that had descended from heaven. The only difference was when they lived and how long they ruled. This continuity presents a problem for modern scholarship. We cannot accept the early numbers as literal, without overturning everything we believe about human history. But the Sumerian scribes clearly did accept them. They preserved them carefully across centuries. They treated them as facts worth recording. What did they know that we have forgotten? What understanding did they possess that we have lost? Let us consider the alternative interpretations that scholars have proposed over the past century. The symbolic interpretation holds that the long reigns represent not literal years, but something else entirely. Perhaps dynasties rather than individuals. Perhaps ceremonial cycles rather than solar years. Perhaps honorific exaggerations meant to convey importance rather than duration. This interpretation has appeal. It allows us to accept the King List as a meaningful document without accepting its impossible claims. The numbers become metaphors, the reign lengths become symbols, and the document can be incorporated into conventional history without disruption. But the symbolic interpretation faces serious problems. First, the post-flood sections of the King List are demonstrably historical. Reign lengths match other records. Kings can be verified through independent sources. If the later sections are literal, why assume the earlier sections are symbolic? Second, the mathematical precision of the antediluvian numbers argues against symbolic interpretation. Symbolic numbers tend to be round, simple, memorable. The numbers in the King List are precise to the last digit, perfectly divisible by the base unit of Sumerian mathematics. This is not how symbolic exaggeration works. Third, there is no indication in the text itself that the early kings should be read differently from the later ones. The King List presents all entries in the same format, with the same matter-of-fact style. It does not signal a shift from mythology to history. The dynastic interpretation proposes that the reign lengths represent not individual kings, but entire dynasties. Perhaps Alulim was not one person who ruled for 28,800 years, but a royal house that maintained power for that duration, with multiple individuals bearing the same name or title. This interpretation has some support from later sections of the King List, where dynasties clearly contain multiple named kings. But it contradicts the explicit listing of individuals in the Antediluvian section. Each king is named separately. Each is assigned a distinct reign length. The text does not present them as dynasties, but as persons. The calendrical interpretation suggests that the Sumerians used different units of time in different periods. Perhaps the Sar, the 3600 unit, represented something shorter than a year in the Antediluvian section. Perhaps months, or lunar cycles, or something else entirely. If we divide the antediluvian reign lengths by 12, converting years to months, the numbers become more plausible, but still impossibly long. Alulim would have ruled for 2,400 years, still far beyond human capacity, still requiring explanation. If we divide by 30, converting to days counted as months in some system, the numbers shrink further. Alulim's reign becomes 80 years, well within human possibility. But this interpretation requires assuming a radically different calendrical system, for which we have no other evidence. The Sumerians were sophisticated astronomers. They tracked lunar cycles with precision. They developed calendars that formed the basis for later systems. There is no evidence that they used different time units for different historical periods. The calendrical interpretation creates more problems than it solves. The corruption interpretation proposes that the numbers were distorted during transmission. Scribal errors, damaged tablets, miscopied digits. Over centuries of transmission, originally reasonable numbers became impossibly inflated. But this interpretation fails to account for the consistency across copies. 17 different tablets, created at different times in different places, all preserve the same numbers. If corruption occurred, it occurred very early and was then faithfully preserved by all subsequent scribes. This strains credibility. Moreover, the mathematical patterns in the numbers argue against random corruption. Errors would produce random results. The perfect divisibility by 3600 across all antediluvian reign lengths suggests systematic encoding, not random distortion. Finally, the literal interpretation takes the numbers at face value. The antediluvian kings ruled for exactly as long as the King List says they did. Whatever they were not human in the ordinary sense. Something about their nature, their biology, their technology, allowed them lifespans that our current understanding cannot accommodate. This interpretation is rejected by mainstream scholarship for obvious reasons. It contradicts everything we think we know about human biology and history. It requires accepting possibilities that our scientific framework does not allow. But it has one significant advantage over all other interpretations. It takes the document seriously on its own terms. It does not require assuming that the Sumerians were liars, fools, or incompetents. It does not require explaining away their precision, their consistency, their careful preservation. It simply accepts what they said and asks what it might mean. Let us examine the mathematics more closely. The SAR, 3600, is not an arbitrary number. It is the product of 60 times 60, and 60 was the base of Sumerian mathematics, their equivalent of our base 10 system. We count in tens, hundreds, thousands. They counted in 60s, 3,600s, 216,000s. The reign lengths in the King List correspond perfectly to this system. 28,800 is 8 times 3,600. 36,000 is 10 times 3,600. 43,200 is 12 times 3,600. The numbers are not random exaggerations. They are precise multiples of the Sumerian mathematical base unit. Some researchers have proposed that the SAR might represent not years, but something else. Perhaps months, perhaps days, perhaps some other unit of time we no longer recognize. If the SAR represented months instead of years, the reign lengths would shrink to hundreds of years. Long, but not impossible. If it represented days, they would shrink further still. But this reinterpretation creates new problems. The post-flood sections of the King List include kings whose reigns can be verified through other historical records. These reigns are recorded in the same units as the antediluvian kings. If we redefine the unit for the early kings, we must redefine it for the later kings as well, and then their reigns no longer match the historical evidence. The Sumerians appear to have been using the same unit throughout. Years, solar years, the same years we use today, the same years they used to track agricultural cycles and astronomical events. There is no textual evidence for a different unit in the early sections, which leaves us with a mystery. Either the Sumerians were recording something that did not happen, carefully preserving precise lies across centuries, or they were recording something we do not understand, preserving a truth that our current framework cannot accommodate. Consider this. The ratio between antediluvian and post-flood rain lengths is not random. If we divide the longest pre-flood rain by the longest post-flood rain, we get a factor of approximately 36. 36 is itself a significant number in Sumerian mathematics, being the square of 6, the fundamental unit of their base 60 system. Patterns within patterns. Mathematics within mathematics. The King List is not the rambling mythology of a primitive culture. It is a precisely structured document encoding information in mathematical form, information that we have not yet fully decoded. The names of the antediluvian kings are themselves significant. Alulim may derive from a Sumerian phrase meaning grown from the waters, suggesting connection to the primordial beginnings. Enmenlu-Ana translates to Lord of the powers of heaven and earth, combining celestial and terrestrial authority. Enmendur-Ana means Lord of the powers of Dur-Ana, with Dur-Ana possibly referring to the cosmic bond between heaven and earth. Dumuzid, the shepherd, later became a major deity in his own right, worshipped across Mesopotamia as a god of vegetation and the underworld. His presence on the king list blurs the line between divine and royal. These names suggest beings who operated between realms, who held authority over both heaven and earth, who were neither fully divine nor fully human. They were something else, something in between, something we have no category for in our modern understanding. The book of Genesis contains a passage that many scholars have connected to the Sumerian King List. In chapters 4 and 5, the Bible lists the patriarchs who lived before the flood, from Adam to Noah. These patriarchs, like the Sumerian kings, lived for impossibly long periods. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912 years. Methuselah, the longest lived, reached 969 years. The numbers are smaller than the Sumerian figures, but the pattern is identical. Extremely long lifespans before the flood, followed by progressive decline afterward. Noah lived 950 years. His son Shem lived only 600 years. Within a few generations, lifespans had shortened to what we consider normal. The correspondence between these traditions is too precise to be coincidental. Both record 8 to 10 figures between creation and flood. Both assign impossibly long lifespans to these figures. Both show progressive decline after the flood. Both treat these records as history rather than mythology. Either one tradition borrowed from the other, or both preserve a common memory of something that actually occurred, something that changed when the flood came, something that was lost. The chronological overlap adds another dimension. If we calculate the total years from Adam to Noah using the biblical genealogies, we get approximately 1,600 years. If we use the Sumerian King List, we get 241,000 years. The difference is enormous. But here is an interesting mathematical relationship. If we multiply the biblical total by 150, we approach the Sumerian total. 150 is itself a significant number, being the product of 50 and 3, both important in Semitic numerology. Perhaps the biblical tradition compressed the Sumerian numbers by a standardized factor. Perhaps information was lost or deliberately reduced during transmission. The Berosus fragments offer yet another perspective. Berosus was a Babylonian priest who wrote a history of Mesopotamia in Greek during the 3rd century BCE. His work is lost, but quotations survive in later authors. According to Berosus, 10 kings ruled before the flood for a total of 432,000 years. This is higher than the Sumerian King List's 241,000 years, but follows the same pattern of impossibly long antediluvian reigns. Berosus named these kings differently from the Sumerian sources. He called the first king Aloros and assigned him a reign of 36,000 years, matching the Sumerian total for the first 2 kings combined. Perhaps he was using a variant tradition. Perhaps information had been consolidated differently. The key point is that Berosus, writing in Greek for a Greek audience, preserved the essential claim of the Sumerian tradition: incredibly long reigns before the flood, a catastrophic break, shortened reigns afterward. The pattern was too important to abandon, even when translating across cultures and centuries. Egyptian sources provide yet another point of comparison. The Egyptian priest Manetho compiled a history of Egypt in the 3rd century BCE, roughly contemporary with Berosus. His king lists included divine dynasties that preceded human rule. According to Manetho, gods ruled Egypt for over 13,000 years before the first human pharaohs. The god Ptah alone reigned for 9,000 years. Horus ruled for 300 years. The total divine reign approached 24,000 years. These numbers are smaller than the Sumerian figures, but still impossibly long by human standards. And they follow the same pattern: divine or semi-divine rulers with incredible longevity, followed by human rulers with normal lifespans. The Egyptian tradition also includes reference to the Shem-Su-Hor, the followers of Horus, who ruled for a period between the gods and the human pharaohs. This intermediate category parallels the declining reign lengths in the post-flood section of the Sumerian King List. A gradual transition from impossibly long reigns to normal human spans. Hindu chronology offers yet another parallel. The concept of the Mahayuga, the Great Cycle of Ages, spans 4,320,000 years. This cycle divides into 4 yugas of decreasing length and quality, from the golden age of Satya Yuga to the current dark age of Kali Yuga. The individual yugas span thousands of years. Satya Yuga lasts 1,728,000 years. Humans during this age supposedly lived for tens of thousands of years, performed incredible feats, and maintained direct contact with divine beings. The pattern is the same: extremely long time scales in the remote past, progressive decline toward the present, a fall from a golden age of divine connection to the current age of limitation. These parallel traditions span cultures that had no direct contact during the periods when the traditions were codified: Sumeria, Egypt, Israel, India. Separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, yet all preserving the same essential pattern: incredibly long reigns or lifespans before a cataclysm, a catastrophic break that ended the old order. Progressive decline in the new order that followed. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. Either these cultures independently invented the same mythological structure, or they are all remembering the same thing, something that actually happened, something that affected the entire world. The Sumerian flood narrative provides additional context for understanding the King List. In the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest flood stories ever discovered, the gods create humanity, but soon become disturbed by human noise and multiplication. They decide to send a flood to reduce the human population. But the god Enki, who helped create humanity, disagrees with this decision. He warns a man named Sudra of the coming disaster and instructs him to build a boat. Sudra survives the flood. And when the waters recede, the gods grant him eternal life and relocate him to a paradise called Dilmun. He becomes, in effect, immortal, elevated beyond normal human existence as a reward for his obedience and survival. This narrative connects to the King List in important ways. The flood marks the end of the Antediluvian age, the age when kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, even the best of humanity could not achieve what the pre-flood kings had achieved. The connection between heaven and earth had weakened. The gift that allowed such longevity was no longer available. What was that gift? The King List does not say directly, but other Sumerian texts provide hints. The Anunnaki, the beings who descended from heaven in Sumerian mythology, were said to possess what they called the food of life and the water of life. These substances conferred longevity, perhaps immortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh, another Sumerian text, describes the hero's quest to obtain these substances after the death of his friend Enkidu. He seeks out the flood survivor, now called Utana-Pishtim, hoping to learn the secret of eternal life. He fails. The plant of rejuvenation slips from his grasp. He returns to Uruk, mortal, destined to die like all humans after the flood. The secret was lost. The gift was withdrawn. The age of the long-lived kings was over. But let us examine the Anunnaki more closely, for they are central to understanding who the antediluvian kings might have been. The word Anunnaki appears frequently in Sumerian texts. It is typically translated as those of royal blood or princely offspring. The term refers to a group of deities, or beings, who played crucial roles in Sumerian cosmology and governance. According to Sumerian tradition, the Anunnaki came from heaven to earth in the distant past. They did not originate here. They arrived from elsewhere, bringing with them knowledge, technology, and the concept of kingship itself. The Anunnaki were not unified in their purposes. Different texts describe different factions with different agendas. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, favored humanity and worked to protect us. Enlil, god of wind and storms, was ambivalent, sometimes protective and sometimes destructive. Anu, the sky god, remained largely distant, an ultimate authority rarely directly involved in earthly affairs. These beings organized human civilization according to their design. They established cities, each with its patron deity. They created systems of governance, with kingship as the mechanism of rule. They developed agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy. Everything that made Sumerian civilization remarkable came, in their own account, from the Anunnaki. The antediluvian kings may have been Anunnaki themselves, or hybrids with Anunnaki blood, or humans who had received Anunnaki gifts of longevity. The King List does not specify clearly, but the impossibly long reigns suggest that these rulers were not ordinary humans. Whatever biological or technological enhancement allowed such longevity, it was not native to our species. The Anunnaki were also credited with creating humanity itself. In the Atrahasis epic, another Sumerian text, the gods create humans as a labor force. The Anunnaki had been doing the hard work of maintaining the world, digging canals, cultivating fields. They rebelled against this labor, and so humanity was created to do the work in their place. This is not a flattering origin story. Humans, in this account, were made as servants. We were designed to relieve the Anunnaki of burdens they no longer wished to carry. Our existence served their convenience. But the creation was more successful than intended. Humans multiplied. We developed capabilities beyond what was planned. We became noisy, in the language of the texts, perhaps meaning we became troublesome, independent, difficult to control. The decision to send the flood may have been an attempt to reduce this troublesome population, to reset the experiment, to restore control. But some Anunnaki disagreed. Enki warned Ziusudra. The flood destroyed much, but not all. Humanity survived, diminished but persistent. After the flood, the relationship between Anunnaki and humanity changed. The beings withdrew, became less visible, less directly involved. Kingship continued to descend from heaven, but the kings themselves were no longer what they had been. The long reigns ended. Human limitations reasserted themselves. What happened to the Anunnaki? The texts do not say clearly. Some may have departed entirely, returning to wherever they came from. Others may have remained, hidden, watching. The traditions of the Watchers in Hebrew literature may preserve memory of beings who stayed behind to observe without interfering. The Anunnaki concept has generated enormous speculation in modern times. Some researchers have proposed that they were extraterrestrial visitors, beings from another planet who came to Earth in the distant past. This hypothesis, associated with authors like Zecharia Sitchin, interprets Sumerian texts as literal accounts of alien contact. Mainstream scholarship rejects this interpretation. The Anunnaki, in academic understanding, were mythological deities, not physical beings. The King List is mythology, not history. The reign lengths are symbolic, not literal. But the Sumerians themselves did not make this distinction. They wrote about the Anunnaki the way they wrote about their human kings. They recorded their actions, their decisions, their conflicts with the same matter-of-fact style used for clearly historical events. Either they were incapable of distinguishing gods from governors, or they saw no distinction to make. The King List reflects this continuity. It does not separate divine figures from human rulers. It treats both as part of the same continuous record of kingship. The descent from heaven is mentioned once at the beginning. Everything that follows is simply the exercise of that descended authority by whoever held it. But the memory remained, carved into clay, preserved across millennia, waiting for someone to take it seriously. The archaeological site of Eridu, the first city where kingship descended, has been excavated multiple times since the 19th century. What archaeologists found there is remarkable. The lowest levels of Eridu, the oldest occupation layers, date to approximately 5400 BCE. This makes Eridu one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians were right to call it the first city. It may well have been. But what is even more significant is what lies beneath those oldest layers. The excavators found evidence of structures built on virgin soil, directly on the natural ground surface. Below these structures, there was nothing. No earlier occupation, no previous habitation. The city was founded on empty land. This matches the King List's account. Kingship descended from heaven to Eridu. The city was not a gradual development from earlier settlements. It appeared suddenly, fully formed, as if it were planted there by someone with a plan. The earliest structures at Eridu include a temple, not a simple shrine, but a substantial building with multiple rooms and careful orientation. This temple was rebuilt and expanded over millennia, each version constructed directly above the previous one, creating a continuous sequence of sacred architecture spanning over 2,000 years. Who built the first temple? Who founded the first city? Who brought kingship to earth? The Sumerians knew the answer. They recorded it clearly. Kingship descended from heaven. The Anunnaki came down. The first king took his throne. Modern archaeology has found no evidence of these beings, but it has found their city. It has found their temple. It has found the clay tablets that record their names and reign lengths. The other antediluvian cities have received less archaeological attention. Bad Tibira, the city of metalworkers, has been tentatively identified with a site called Tel al-Madina in southern Iraq, but excavations have been limited. Larak remains unlocated. Sippar has been extensively excavated, but primarily for its later historical periods. Shurupak, identified with the modern site of Tel Farah, has yielded tablets from the 3rd millennium BCE, but nothing from the antediluvian age. The absence of physical evidence from the antediluvian period is sometimes cited as proof that the King List is mythological. If kings ruled for hundreds of thousands of years, where are their palaces, their monuments, their tombs? But consider the timescales involved. The antediluvian age ended with a global flood, according to the King List. Whatever structures existed would have been destroyed or buried. The cities would have been rebuilt on top of the ruins, layer upon layer, until the original foundations lay deep beneath millennia of subsequent occupation. At Eridu, excavators reached virgin soil after digging through over 5 meters of accumulated debris. The lowest temple sits directly on the original ground surface. Beneath it, nothing. But nothing does not mean never anything. It means nothing survived. Whatever came before was erased completely. If there was an antediluvian civilization, we should not expect to find its remains easily. We should expect exactly what we find. Later structures built on apparently virgin soil. Traditions of earlier greatness without physical proof. Memory without evidence. The evidence for what the Sumerians believed is overwhelming. The evidence for what actually happened remains subject to interpretation. Beyond the Weld-Blundell Prism, 16 other copies of the King List have been discovered. Each adds details, confirms patterns, and presents challenges to simple explanation. The UCBC text, held at the University of California, Berkeley, preserves a version with slight variations in the reign lengths, but identical structure. The same 8 kings, the same 5 cities, the same flood boundary. The Kish tablet, discovered at that ancient city, provides a version focused on post-flood dynasties, but still references the Antediluvian age as the foundation of all that followed. The Larsa King List extends the record into later periods while maintaining the mathematical patterns of the earlier sections. Each discovery confirms that the King List was not a local tradition, but a widespread Mesopotamian understanding of history. Different cities, different scribes, different centuries, all preserving the same essential record. This consistency is itself significant. Error and variation naturally accumulate in copied documents. The stability of the King List across versions suggests either extraordinary care in transmission or extraordinary importance assigned to the content, perhaps both. The Sumerians treated the King List as sacred history, the foundation of their understanding of how civilization began and how authority operated. To alter it would be to alter the basis of social order itself. Small wonder they preserved it so carefully. Let us consider what the King List tells us about the nature of antediluvian civilization. 5 cities existed before the flood. 5 cities across 241,000 years. This suggests a very different pattern of development from what we see in later history. In the post-flood world, cities proliferate rapidly. Dynasties rise and fall. Power shifts from place to place. The King List records dozens of cities and hundreds of kings in the millennia after the flood. But before the flood, only 5 cities. Over a span longer than all subsequent human history combined. Either civilization was remarkably stable, or remarkably controlled, or remarkably different from what came after. The cities themselves may offer clues. Eridu, the first, was associated with the god Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh water. Bad Tabira was associated with metalworking and craft. Larik's associations are less clear. Sippar was connected to the sun god Shamash, later becoming a center of astronomical observation. Shuruppak was the city of the flood hero, perhaps a center of whatever knowledge allowed survival of the catastrophe. 5 cities, each with distinct functions, as if the antediluvian world was organized not as competing powers, but as specialized centers within a unified system, as if someone had planned it that way. The transition between cities is also significant. According to the King List, kingship moved from city to city over the antediluvian period. Eridu held it first, then Bad Tabira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. Each city hosted multiple kings before passing authority to the next. Why did kingship move? The King List does not say, but the pattern suggests rotation rather than conquest, planning rather than conflict. The antediluvian world was not like the post-flood world of competing dynasties and military campaigns. It was something else, something more ordered, something more controlled. The flood changed everything. After the waters receded, the pattern of peaceful transition ended. Post-flood dynasties competed violently. Cities rose and fell through warfare. The unity of the Antediluvian age was replaced by the fragmentation we recognize from all subsequent history. What was lost in the flood? Not just lives and cities, a whole system of organization, a whole way of structuring civilization, a whole approach to rulership that had maintained stability for hundreds of thousands of years. And yet the memory persisted. The idea that kingship came from heaven, the belief that legitimate authority derived from divine source, the dream of returning to the golden age before the waters came. Every subsequent Mesopotamian kingdom claimed continuity with the antediluvian kings. Every ruler sought legitimacy by connecting their dynasty to that original descent of kingship. The pattern established before the flood shaped politics for millennia after. The King List makes claims about time that challenge everything we think we know about human history. Conventional archaeology places the beginning of Sumerian civilization around 3500 BCE. The oldest written records date to approximately 3100 BCE. Before that, we have archaeological evidence of settlement, agriculture, and material culture, but no written history. The King List extends history backward by a factor of 70, 241,000 years before the flood, compared to the roughly 5,000 years of recorded history we conventionally acknowledge. These timescales cannot both be correct. Either the King List is wrong, or our conventional chronology is incomplete. Modern scholarship assumes the King List is wrong. The numbers are symbolic, metaphorical, exaggerated, or corrupted. The antediluvian kings are mythological figures rather than historical rulers. The flood is a local event remembered as cosmic catastrophe. But consider what accepting this assumption requires. It requires believing that Sumerian scribes, who were capable of precise astronomical calculations and sophisticated mathematics, randomly assigned numbers to fictional kings. It requires believing that 17 different copies of the same document all preserved the same random numbers across centuries of transmission. It requires believing that the mathematical patterns in the reign lengths, all perfectly divisible by 3600, are coincidental. The alternative is more challenging, but also more interesting. What if the King List is not wrong? What if it preserves genuine memory of a time before the flood, a time when different beings ruled the earth, a time when the normal rules of human existence did not apply? This interpretation requires us to expand our framework. It requires considering possibilities that mainstream scholarship has dismissed. But it does not require us to abandon reason or evidence. It requires us to take the evidence we have, the King List itself, seriously as a source of information. The Sumerians believed they were recording history. They preserved that record with extraordinary care across centuries. Perhaps we should at least consider the possibility that they knew something we have forgotten. The figure of Enmendur-Ana deserves special attention. He was the seventh antediluvian king, ruling in Sippar for 21,000 years. His name means Lord of the Powers of Durana, with Durana referring to the cosmic bond or connection between heaven and earth. Other Sumerian texts describe Enmendur-Ana as an extraordinary figure. He was taken up to heaven by the gods Shamash and Adad. He was taught the secrets of divination and celestial observation. He was initiated into knowledge that was forbidden to ordinary humans. When he returned to earth, Enmendur-Ana established the practices of priesthood and prophecy. He founded lineages of diviners that persisted for millennia. He transmitted the heavenly knowledge to selected humans, creating a chain of secret teaching that extended through history. This narrative parallels the biblical account of Enoch, the seventh patriarch in the Genesis genealogy. Enoch walked with God and was taken up to heaven without dying. Later Jewish tradition elaborated this story extensively. Enoch became the recipient of divine secrets, the scribe of heaven, the transmitter of hidden knowledge. The parallel between Enmendarana and Enoch is striking. Both were seventh in their respective lists. Both were taken to heaven. Both received hidden knowledge. Both founded traditions of esoteric teaching. This correspondence strengthens the connection between Sumerian and biblical traditions. It suggests a common source, a shared memory of figures who walked between worlds and carried knowledge from one realm to another. Whether we call him Enmendarana or Enoch, the same story is being told. What knowledge did he receive? What secrets were transmitted? The Sumerian texts speak of divination, of reading omens in the sky and on the earth, but they also hint at something more fundamental: knowledge of how the world works, understanding of the connections between heaven and earth, awareness of patterns and cycles that govern existence itself. This knowledge was not for everyone. It was reserved for initiates, for priests, for those who had prepared themselves to receive it. It was dangerous knowledge, capable of great good or great harm, depending on how it was used. It required careful transmission and careful guarding. The mystery schools of later antiquity claimed descent from such traditions. Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, Persian magi, all spoke of secret knowledge passed down from before the flood. They claimed to preserve fragments of what had been known in the Antediluvian age, when the connection between heaven and earth was still intact. Whether these claims are true cannot be proven. But the consistency of the claims across cultures and millennia suggests that something is being remembered. Something that the Sumerian King List also remembers. Something that was known before the waters came and swept the old world away. The mathematical structure of the King List continues to yield insights under analysis. The total reign of antediluvian kings is 241,200 years. This number breaks down as follows. 241,200 equals 67 times 3600. 67 is itself significant, being close to the number of years in certain astronomical cycles. But there is another way to analyze the total. 241,200 equals 120 times 2010. 120 appears throughout Mesopotamian tradition as a number of completion. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood lasts 120 days according to some versions. The biblical account limits human lifespan after the flood to 120 years. The individual reign lengths also show patterns when analyzed as fractions of the total. Alulim's 28,800 years is exactly 12% of the total. Enmenluana's 43,200 years is exactly 18%. The reigns are not random allocations, but proportional divisions of a fixed total. This suggests planning. The Antediluvian age was not a sequence of random rulers serving arbitrary terms. It was a structured period, divided according to mathematical principles, allocated according to design. Who made this design? The King List does not say explicitly, but it does say where kingship came from. It descended from heaven. The design came from the same place. The Anunnaki, the beings who descended, did not merely rule. They organized. They planned. They structured human civilization according to principles that mathematics can still detect 40 centuries after the last scribe copied the King List onto clay. What were they building? What was the purpose of 241,000 years of carefully planned rulership? What were they trying to achieve? The flood interrupted whatever they were doing. The plan was cut short. The experiment was terminated. And then, after the waters receded, something different emerged. Shorter reigns, competing dynasties, warfare and chaos. The post-flood world was not planned. It was improvised. Perhaps this is the most significant message of the King List. Not the impossible numbers, not the divine descent of kingship, but the contrast between before and after, between the designed world of the antediluvian age and the chaotic world that replaced it. Something was lost. Something more than just lives and cities. A whole approach to organizing existence. A whole framework for managing humanity. Whatever the Anunnaki were doing, they were no longer doing it after the flood. Why did the flood come? The Sumerian texts offer an answer that differs from the biblical version. In Genesis, the flood is punishment for human wickedness. God sees that humanity has become corrupt and decides to cleanse the earth. In Sumerian tradition, the reason is different. The gods are disturbed by human noise. Humanity has multiplied too greatly. The sound of human activity keeps the gods from sleeping. They decide to reduce the population through catastrophe. This is a strangely mundane reason for cosmic destruction. Not moral judgment, not divine wrath. Inconvenience. The gods are annoyed. But perhaps this version conceals something deeper. What if the noise represents not literal sound, but something else? Growth beyond planned limits. Development beyond intended boundaries. Humans doing something they were not supposed to do. The book of Genesis, in the verses immediately preceding the flood account, describes the sons of God taking human women as wives. Their offspring were the Nephilim, beings of great power and fame. This mixing of divine and human was presented as corruption, as the catalyst for divine judgment. The Sumerian version may be describing the same event in different terms: humanity multiplying, noise increasing, the system going out of control. Whatever the antediluvian order was designed to maintain was breaking down. And so the flood came, to reset, to start over, to restore boundaries that had been crossed. But the reset was not complete. Something survived. Not just Ziusudra and his family. Memory survived. Knowledge survived. The King List survived. The awareness that things had once been different, that beings had once descended from heaven, that kingship itself was a gift from elsewhere. This memory haunted all subsequent Mesopotamian civilization. Every king sought to reconnect with the Antediluvian age. Every temple was built as a stairway between heaven and earth. Every ritual was an attempt to restore the connection that the flood had severed. The ziggurats, those massive stepped towers that defined Mesopotamian cities, were called mountains of God, stairways to heaven. They were not just temples, they were technology, attempts to rebuild the link between realms that had existed before the flood. The ziggurat of Ur, one of the best preserved, rose over 100 feet above the flat Mesopotamian plain. Its 3 massive stages supported a temple at the summit, where priests performed rituals meant to bridge the gap between earth and sky. The entire structure was an artificial mountain, created by human labor to serve purposes humans could no longer accomplish naturally. Why build such structures? The Mesopotamians believed that the gods had withdrawn after the flood. The direct access that existed in the Antediluvian age was no longer available. The ziggurats were attempts to restore that access, to climb high enough to reach what had become distant. The famous Tower of Babel story in Genesis may preserve memory of this impulse. The people of Shinar, which is Sumeria, sought to build a tower reaching to heaven. They wanted to restore what had been lost. They wanted to become like the Antediluvian kings, with access to the divine realm. According to the biblical account, God was displeased with this effort. The languages were confused, the people were scattered, the tower was abandoned. Humanity was prevented from regaining what the flood had taken away. This story, whatever its historical basis, reflects awareness that something had been lost. The antediluvian access to heaven was gone. Attempts to restore it through technology or effort were forbidden or impossible. Humanity was now limited in ways that earlier ages had not been. The mystery traditions of later antiquity claim to preserve fragments of antediluvian knowledge. The Egyptian priests at Heliopolis maintained libraries they said contained records from before the flood. The Greek philosophers who visited Egypt, including Pythagoras, Plato, and Solon, reported being told of civilizations and catastrophes far older than Greek history acknowledged. Plato's account of Atlantis, whatever else it may be, fits this pattern. A great civilization in the remote past, destroyed by cataclysm, remembered only in fragments preserved by Egyptian priests. The details may be invention, but the structure matches the Sumerian King List's division between a glorious antediluvian age and the diminished world that followed. The Hermetic traditions of late antiquity explicitly claimed descent from Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom, who was identified with the antediluvian patriarch Enoch. Hermetic texts like the Corpus Hermeticum presented themselves as preservations of ancient knowledge, truths from before the current age that had been passed down through initiatic lineages. Whether any of these traditions actually preserved antediluvian knowledge is unknown, and probably unknowable. But the claim itself is significant. The idea that such knowledge once existed, that it was lost in catastrophe, and that fragments might survive in hidden traditions, this idea persists across cultures and millennia. The Sumerian King List is the oldest documentary evidence for this pattern. It is the foundation upon which later traditions built. Whatever the subsequent elaborations and inventions, the King List precedes them all. It is the original claim. The first written record of rule by beings who were not like us, in an age that ended with catastrophe. Did any of them succeed? The King List does not say. It records the reigns of post-flood kings in their declining lengths. It tracks the fragmentation of the unified order into competing dynasties. It documents the fall from the Antediluvian Golden Age into the Iron Age of human history. But it also preserves the memory of what was. The names of the 8 kings, the cities they ruled, the time before the waters came. As if the scribes hoped that someday someone would read their record and understand. We are those readers now. 40 centuries later, we hold their words in our hands. What do we do with this inheritance? Before we close, let us acknowledge what scholarship says. The academic consensus offers a different interpretation of these impossible numbers. Assyriologists, the specialists who dedicate their careers to studying these texts, propose that the antediluvian reign lengths are symbolic rather than literal. The Sumerians, they argue, used exaggerated numbers as a form of royal propaganda. To say a king ruled for 28,000 years was to say he was incomparably great, divinely favored, beyond ordinary measure. It was poetry, not arithmetic. It was praise, not history. The Sar, that unit of 3,600, was considered sacred in Sumerian numerology. Assigning reign lengths in multiples of the Sar elevated these kings to a special category, marking them as different from ordinary rulers, without necessarily claiming they lived that long biologically. Furthermore, the mixing of gods and kings in ancient texts served political purposes. When a current king claimed descent from divine ancestors with impossible reign lengths, he was legitimizing his own rule. He was saying, "My authority comes from the same source as these ancient figures." The exaggeration served power, not history. The archaeological record, scholars point out, shows gradual development rather than sudden appearance. Civilization at Eridu evolved slowly through recognizable stages. There is no buried layer of advanced technology waiting to be discovered. The progression from simple to complex is visible in the stratigraphy. These are reasonable arguments. They fit within our current scientific framework. They explain the data without requiring us to overturn everything we believe about biology and history. And yet, the questions remain. Why the precise mathematical patterns? Why the consistency across 17 copies separated by centuries? Why the seamless transition from impossible numbers to verifiable history? Why do parallel traditions across unconnected cultures preserve the same essential structure? Perhaps the scholars are correct. Perhaps the Sumerians were exaggerating for effect, encoding prestige rather than duration, creating mythology rather than recording memory. Or perhaps they knew something we have forgotten. Perhaps the choice is not between accepting their numbers literally and dismissing them as propaganda. Perhaps there is a third possibility we have not yet discovered, a meaning we have not yet decoded, a truth buried beneath our assumptions. This is not a documentary claiming scientific certainty. This is an exploration of mystery, a contemplation of possibility. An invitation to wonder what the deep past might contain that our current frameworks cannot accommodate. The King List exists. The numbers are what they are. The interpretations remain open. What you believe is your choice. What matters is that you have heard the evidence, considered the alternatives, and allowed yourself to wonder. The night deepens as we consider the implications. If the Sumerian King List records genuine memory, then human history is far longer and far stranger than we have been taught. Civilization did not begin 5,000 years ago. It was rebuilt 5,000 years ago, after a catastrophe that destroyed what came before. The beings who ruled before the flood were not human in the ordinary sense. Their reign lengths prove that, if nothing else. Whatever they were, they operated on timescales that our biology cannot match. They came from elsewhere. They brought kingship with them. They organized humanity according to their design, and then they were gone, or mostly gone. The flood marked their departure as much as humanity's destruction. The post-flood world was human in a way the antediluvian world was not. Shorter lives, shorter reigns, shorter horizons. But they left traces. The King List is one such trace. The ziggurats and temples are others. The persistent human belief that legitimate authority comes from divine source, that kings rule by heaven's mandate, that there is a proper order connecting above and below. These beliefs span cultures and continents. They appear in societies that had no contact with Mesopotamia. As if the memory is not specifically Sumerian, but universally human. As if whatever happened before the flood affected not just one region, but the entire planet. The global flood narratives support this interpretation. Over 500 cultures around the world preserve stories of a great flood that destroyed an earlier world. These stories share common elements despite their geographic separation. A warning. A vessel. Survival of a chosen few. A new beginning after the waters recede. The Sumerians were not alone in remembering. They were simply the first to write it down in a form that survived to reach us. What else might have been written? What records existed that did not survive? The Library of Alexandria, burned and scattered. The texts destroyed by conquering armies. The tablets that remain unexcavated beneath the sands of Iraq. We are working with fragments. The King List is a fragment. The flood narratives are fragments. The archaeological sites are fragments. We piece them together as best we can, trying to reconstruct something that was once whole. And the picture that emerges is troubling. It suggests that we are not the first, that others came before, that the confident progress narrative of human history, from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to knowledge, is incomplete at best, false at worst. What if we are not progressing? What if we are recovering? What if everything we have achieved in the last 5,000 years is simply restoration of what was lost in the flood? The Sumerians invented writing, or so we are told. But what if they were reinventing it? What if writing existed before the flood and had to be redeveloped after? The Sumerians developed mathematics, astronomy, agriculture. Or did they receive these gifts, as their own texts suggest? Did knowledge descend along with kingship, gifts from beings who had possessed it all along? The King List does not answer these questions directly, but it opens them. It creates space for possibilities that conventional history forecloses. It invites us to consider that the deep past may be deeper than we imagine. 241,000 years of non-human rule. That is what the tablets say. That is what 17 copies preserve. That is what Sumerian scribes believed important enough to transmit across centuries. Perhaps they were wrong. Perhaps it is all mythology, symbolism, exaggeration. But perhaps they were right. Perhaps they knew something we have forgotten. Perhaps the oldest surviving record of rulership on Earth is trying to tell us something we are not yet ready to hear. The clay sits in museums now. Oxford, Berkeley, Baghdad. The cuneiform script has been decoded. The words have been translated. The numbers have been calculated. But the meaning remains elusive. The mystery remains unsolved. The question remains open. Who were the Antediluvian kings? Where did they come from? What were they doing here for 241,000 years? And what happened when the flood swept over the land and ended their reign forever? These questions will not be answered tonight. They may never be fully answered. The evidence is fragmentary. The time gap is immense. The frameworks we would need to understand have been lost. But the questions persist. They have persisted for 4,000 years, since the first scribe pressed stylus to clay and recorded the names of kings who ruled before the world we know began. When kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Those words opened the King List 4 millennia ago. They open it still. They will continue to open it for as long as humans read and wonder and ask what came before. Let the words settle into silence now. Let the mystery find its place in your thoughts. Let the numbers, impossible and precise, echo in your memory. 28,800 years. 36,000 years. 43,200 years. 8 kings, 5 cities. 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over the land. Sleep well tonight. Dream of ancient cities and impossible reigns. Dream of clay tablets and careful scribes. Dream of kingship descending from heaven and landing in a city called Eridu. Consider what the Sumerians achieved in their brief millennia of civilization. They invented writing, or perhaps reinvented it. They developed mathematics that we still use today. Our 60-second minutes, our 360-degree circles, our 12-hour days, all derive from their base 60 system. They mapped the stars with precision. They codified laws. They built cities that remained population centers for thousands of years. All of this they attributed to gifts from the gods, to knowledge that descended along with kingship, to inheritance from beings who came before and taught humanity how to organize civilization. Were they simply being modest? Were they crediting divine sources for their own achievements, as many cultures have done? Or were they reporting something they genuinely believed? That the foundations of their civilization were not invented, but transmitted. Not discovered, but inherited. The King List suggests the latter. It presents civilization as a gift, kingship as a descent, knowledge as something that came from elsewhere and was given to humanity for purposes we may not fully understand. This is a different way of understanding our own history, not as the triumphant rise of human ingenuity from primitive beginnings, but as the slow recovery from catastrophic loss. Not as progress from nothing to something, but as restoration of what was known before. If the Sumerian view is correct, then our current civilization is not the peak of human achievement. It is a rebuilding, a reconstruction, an attempt to reclaim what was lost when the floods swept over the land and ended the Antediluvian age. We have recovered much, perhaps more than was recovered in previous post-catastrophe ages. Our technology exceeds anything known in recorded history. Our knowledge encompasses fields the Sumerians could not have imagined. But have we recovered everything? The antediluvian kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. They lived in stable cities for hundreds of millennia. They possessed something, some gift or technology or biological enhancement, that we have not regained. The quest for extended longevity continues today. Scientists study aging. Biotechnologists seek interventions. Visionaries dream of uploading consciousness to escape biological limits. The dream of longer life, perhaps immortality, drives enormous investment and effort. Perhaps we are trying to rediscover what the antediluvian kings possessed. Perhaps our technological progress is, at some level, an attempt to restore capabilities that once existed. Perhaps the Sumerian memory of impossibly long reigns is not just history, but prophecy. A reminder of what is possible, a goal we have not yet achieved, but might someday attain. Or perhaps the flood ended something that should have ended. Perhaps the antediluvian age was not a golden time, but a controlled experiment. Perhaps humanity needed to be freed from the long-lived rulers in order to develop our own capabilities, make our own mistakes, find our own path. The King List does not resolve these questions. It simply presents the data. 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,000 years. Then the flood swept over the land. What we make of this data is up to us. Whether we dismiss it as mythology, decode it as symbolism, or accept it as memory of something that actually occurred. The tablets do not demand any particular response. They simply preserve what the Sumerians believed was true. And they wait. In museum cases and archive boxes and digital databases. They wait for someone to understand. They wait for the recovery to reach the point where their message can be properly received. The Sumerians left their record for someone to find. Perhaps that someone is you. Perhaps tonight, in the quiet hours, you will understand something that has waited 4,000 years to be understood. The stars turn overhead, the same stars the antediluvian kings watched, the same patterns they knew, the same sky they came from, if the King List speaks truth. You are connected now to something very old. You have heard the names. You have considered the numbers. You have asked the questions that the tablets provoke. Carry this with you, not as certainty, not as belief, but as wonder, as possibility, as the recognition that the past may be stranger than we have been told. The King List waits in its museum cases. The cuneiform script preserves its message. The mystery remains. And you are not alone in contemplating it. Across the world, in every time zone, others are asking the same questions. Others are looking at the same evidence. Others are wondering what the Sumerians knew that we have forgotten. We are scattered across the globe, but we are gathered in curiosity, connected by questions that are older than any living civilization. The night is deep now. Let it hold you. The ancient builders are speaking across 4,000 years.